Hello and welcome to In Control, the first podcast on control theory. Here we discuss the science of feedback, decision-making, artificial intelligence, and much more. Hello and welcome to In Control. I'm your host, Alberto Padoan, live from a recording studio in Vancouver. Quick thanks to our sponsor, the National Center of Competence in Research on Dependable Ubiquitous Automation and International Federation of Automatic Control. In this episode, we delve into the life and legacy of Alexander Mikhailovich Lyapunov. Apologies for the Russian speakers. I'm not a native in that language, but yet we're going to explore a towering figure whose name is synonymous with stability in science and engineering. Born in Imperial Russia and coming of age in an era of grand scientific inquiry, Lyapunov's contributions transcended disciplines. If you studied control theory or chaos, you've likely heard the term Lyapunov stability or Lyapunov exponent. These concepts all trace back to this one remarkable individual. In fact, Christopher Bissell, a famous historian for those who care about control theory, noted that rarely can a doctoral thesis have such an enormous influence on a scientific or engineering discipline. That dissertation bore Lyapunov's name, and more than a century later, its echoes still guide systems and control theory and far beyond. But behind the formulas stand a deeply human story, one of intellectual passion, a nurturing scientific family, personal devotion and tragedy, and a legacy that would shape science and engineering for generations. Over the next hour or so, we'll journey through Lyapunov's life, from his upbringing in a gifted family and the influence of legendary mentors like Chebyshev, to the formulation of his stability theorems and dramatic circumstances of his final days. We'll start in what I hope will be an accessible way, painting a picture of his life and contributions without too much technical detail, but later in the episode, for the more technically inclined, we'll delve deeper into the science behind his famous stability theory and other contributions. So don't worry, for the first half or so, it is intended to be for everyone, and then we'll geek out a bit in the second half. Along the way, I'll try to quote from letters and memoirs as much as possible, like Lyapunov's own family, students, and colleagues, to help bring this historical figure to life in his own words. So get comfortable as we weave together historical storytelling with technical insight. By the end, we'll not only appreciate what Lyapunov proved in 1892, but why it still matters today in 2025. In the spirit of our Bellman episode, we'll be mixing the personal and the scientific, the anecdotal and the analytical, all centered on Lyapunov, a man who sought stability in a world of change. Alexander Mikhailovich Lyapunov was born on May 25, 1857 in Yaroslav, an ancient Russian provincial city northeast of Moscow situated on the Volga River, known for its cultural heritage, medieval architecture, and its important role in shaping Russian identity. He grew up in a family of notable erudition. His father, Mikhail Vasilievich Lyapunov, was a distinguished astronomer who had founded an observatory at Kazan University and later became director of the Demidov Lyceum in Yaroslav. Alexander's mother, Sofia Alexandrovna née Shipilova, came from an educated family as well. There were 7 children in the family, but only 3 sons reached adult age. Alexander was the eldest son. His parents instilled in Alexander and his siblings a love for knowledge from a very early age. In fact, the Lyapunov household could be described as a sort of intellectual greenhouse, one that produced not only Alexander the mathematician, but also 2 other remarkably accomplished sons. Sergei Mikhailovich Lyapunov, born in 1859, was Alexander's younger brother by 2 years and would become a renowned composer and pianist, a student of Mili Balakirev and contributor to the Russian classical music tradition. In a twist of cultural fate, Sergei's name has sometimes outshone Alexander in popular perception. Even today, a quick YouTube search, and I encourage you to do that, for Lyapunov is likely to pull up recordings of Sergei's lush, romantic piano pieces as it is to find lectures on Lyapunov stability theory. Try it for yourself. And then comes Boris Mikhailovich Lyapunov, born in 1864, and he was the youngest brother and became a prominent philologist specializing in Slavic languages and folklore. Boris eventually rose to an academician in the Soviet Academy of Science, contributing to linguistics and preserving Slavic literary heritage. To round out this cultivated family tree, the Lyapunovs were very well connected to other luminaries. Alexandra's maternal aunt married into the Sekhenov family. Her husband, Raphael Sekhenov, was the brother of Ivan Sekhenov, the famous father of Russian physiology. From that union was born Natalia Raphaelovna Sekhenova, Alexandra's first cousin. And as fate and perhaps many evenings of studying together would have it, Natalia later became Alexandra's wife. Another branch of the family tied the Lyapunovs to celebrated mathematician Alexei Krylov. This could be another potentially very well-known name in the control community. Alexandra's paternal uncle had a daughter, Sofia, who was Krylov's mother, making Krylov a kind of second cousin to Alexandra. Krylov himself would become an influential naval engineer and mathematician. In 1931, he published a landmark paper introducing what is now called the Krylov subspace and Krylov subspace methods. These subspaces are very, very well connected to the notion of observability, of reachability, and the work addressed essentially eigenvalue problems. In particular, the computation of characteristic polynomial coefficients. This was extremely striking in terms of its attention to computational efficiency. Krylov explicitly counted the numerical multiplications required by competing approaches, including the Jacobi method, and showed that his own procedure was not only more efficient than the known methods of his time, but it has endured actually as a staple of numerical linear algebra. In fact, today Krylov's methods remain central across many areas of applied mathematics and engineering. They underpin algorithms for eigenvalue computations, the solution of large-scale Sylvester and Lyapunov equations, and model reduction techniques widely used in systems and control. This rich family environment meant young Lyapunov grew up surrounded by science, music, and literature. The mathematician and later biographer Vladimir Smirnov noted that, and I quote, "All circumstances, both at home and as well as with his closest relatives, awakened in him an interest in science." Alexandr received his first schooling at home from his father, who no doubt taught him to gaze at the stars and appreciate the rigor of celestial mechanics. Sadly, Mikhail Lyapunov died in 1868 when Alexandr was only 11. After this loss, Alexander's upbringing was overseen by his mother and his uncle Raphael Sekhenov, Ivan's brother, at their estate in Nizhny Novgorod, about 400 kilometers southeast of Yaroslav. In 1870, his mother moved the family there permanently. Alexandr and his cousin Natalia studied together under private tutors to prepare for entry into the gymnasium. One can imagine the household, the budding mathematician and his equally brilliant cousin, poring over books by lamplight, encouraged by Uncle Raphael and occasionally visited by the great physiologist Ivan Sekhenov himself. Alexandr enrolled in the Nizhny Novgorod gymnasium, where he proved an exceptional student, graduating in 1876 with a gold medal at the age of 19. That same year, he was admitted to the prestigious St. Petersburg Imperial University, initially in the physics department before swiftly transferring to mathematics after 1 month. It was St. Petersburg that Lyapunov would come into his own, nurtured by one of the most influential mathematical circles of the 19th century worldwide. The late 1870s were a golden era for mathematics in St. Petersburg, thanks largely to Pafnuty Lvovich Chebyshev, the patriarch of the Russian mathematical school. Chebyshev and his students like Alexander Korkin and Yegor Zolotarev were already towering figures, and Lyapunov stepped right into their world. As a university student, Alexander attended Chebyshev's lectures and later acknowledged, and I quote, that Chebyshev, through his lectures and subsequent guidance, imparted a creative influence on the character of his research. Chebyshev's sons became a mentor to Lyapunov, instilling in him a bold approach to problem solving. Chebyshev's philosophy, as Lyapunov would recall, was that, and I quote again, young mathematicians should test their strength on serious, challenging problems rather than settling for easily solved ones. One of Lyapunov's other professors was Dmitry Konstantinovich Bobilev, a mechanics specialist who took Lyapunov under his wing. Under Bobilev's supervision, Lyapunov wrote an award-winning student essay on hydrostatics in 1880, investigating the equilibrium of floating bodies and the potential of a fluid pressure. This work earned him a gold medal and became the basis of his first 2 published papers in 1881. Bobilev recognized Lyapunov's talent and helped him secure a position as a junior faculty, essentially an assistant in mechanics, at the university after graduation in 1880. Lyapunov would remain closely associated with Bobilev for decades. Many years later, he fondly reminisced about Bobilev's patient guidance for his first youthful work, often of a fairly naive character, and here I'm quoting Lyapunov's words himself. Lyapunov expressed deep gratitude for his teacher's shining personality. It is clear that Lyapunov thrived under mentorship that combined high expectations, Chebyshev's push for hard problems, with supportive oversight, Bobilev's nurturing review of his work. By 1882, having passed his master's level examinations, the 25-year-old Lyapunov was eagerly searching for a worthy topic for his master dissertation. In the Russian system at the time, a pre-doctoral thesis required to earn a Master of Science degree. It was then that Chebyshev posed to Lyapunov a problem both extremely difficult and deeply significant, a problem at the cutting edge of mathematical physics in the 19th century. According to Lyapunov's own recollections, Chebyshev cautioned him not to waste effort on small, easily solved questions, but instead to test his strength on a great theoretical challenge. Chebyshev then proposed the following, in Lyapunov's words. It is known that for certain values of the angular velocity, ellipsoidal forms cease to serve as forms of equilibrium of rotating fluids. Do they not go over in this case to some new forms of equilibrium which, for a small increase of angular velocity, would differ little from ellipsoids? He added, if you solve this question, your work would be immediately receiving attention. This remarkable quote, essentially a dare from Chebyshev, pinpointed one of the era's major unsolved problems. But let me tell you a bit more about context. Mathematicians and astronomers were fascinated by the shapes that a spinning fluid mass, like a rotating drop or a planetary body, could assume. Since Newton, it was known that a rotating self-gravitating fluid could form an oblate spheroid in equilibrium. For the oblate spheroid, think of a squashed sphere. This is called a Maclaurin ellipsoid for those who are curious. In 1834, Carl Jacobi, a German mathematician who made fundamental contributions to a number of areas in mathematics, including elliptic functions, differential equations, and number theory, had discovered a new family of equilibrium figures. Jacobi showed that triaxial ellipsoids, think of elongated rugby ball-like shapes, could be stable at certain rotation speeds. But beyond a certain rotation rate, even Jacobi's ellipsoids became unstable. So the question was, what happens then? Do entirely new non-ellipsoidal shapes, perhaps like pear-shaped or dumbbell-shaped, become possible equilibrium forms? This was not just a theoretical fancy. It tied into hypotheses about how binary stars or planetary moons might form by spinning fission. By the late 1880s, Henri Poincaré and others in France were actively investigating this question of new rotating figures. In fact, in 1886, Poincaré had published a major memoir titled Sur l'équilibre d'une masse fluide, animée de mouvements de rotation, suggesting that as rotation increases, an ellipsoid might continuously deform into a pear-shaped figure. A bold claim that such a pair could be an equilibrium shape that might explain, say, the split of a moon from a planet. However, Poincaré's work left some gaps, and it did not rigorously prove the existence of the pear-shaped figure, nor its stability, leaving room for doubt. Chebyshev's challenge to Lyapunov in 1882 was thus right on the frontier of research. Solve this, he implied, and you solve a puzzle that has tantalized the greatest minds from Jacobi to Liouville to Poincaré. Chebyshev even confided that he had posed the same problem to other talented mathematicians, like Igor Zolotarev and Sofia Kovalevskaya in the past, though it seems neither had solved it. Kovalevskaya, for example, became a pioneer in her own right in the area of partial differential equations, and likely found it outside her primary interests. Young Lyapunov was captivated, and here I quote him, "I became strongly interested in this question. The more so since Chebyshev had not only given any hints for his solution, and I immediately set to work." Lyapunov would later admit that after, and I quote again, several unsuccessful attempts, he had to postpone directly solving Chebyshev's puzzle of finding new equilibrium forms. However, his detour led him to an adjacent, equally important problem, the stability of the known ellipsoidal forms. In other words, rather than discovering a new shape outright, Lyapunov tackled the question of under what conditions are the classical ellipsoids, say Maclaurin and Jacobi ellipsoids, stable or unstable. If they become unstable at a certain spin, the very fact suggests that the system might bifurcate to something new, like the conjectured pear shape. By focusing on such a question, Lyapunov found a tractable and fundamental piece of the larger puzzle. Lyapunov's master dissertation, titled On the Stability of Ellipsoidal Forms of Equilibrium of a Rotating Fluid, was completed and defended in the early 1884 at the St. Petersburg University. His examiners included his mentor Bobilev and Professor Budayev, a specialist from the Artillery Academy. The work made immediately a splash in the mathematical community. Upon publication, a summary appeared in the French journal Bulletin Astronomique, signaling to Europe that a significant result had been achieved. Indeed, this dissertation put Lyapunov's name on the scientific map. In the words of Patrick Parkes, another historian, this was, and I quote, "the work that established his name in Europe." In 1904, at the initiative of the French mathematician Émile Coursera, Lyapunov's 1884 thesis was translated into French and published in the Annales de l'Université de Toulouse, further amplifying its international reach. So what had Lyapunov actually accomplished in this master thesis? In brief, he carried out a meticulous analysis of the dynamical stability of rotating ellipsoids under small perturbations. Using and extending a variational approach, notably the Thomson-Tate energy principle in fluid mechanics, Lyapunov derived conditions under which an ellipsoid would return to its shape, if slightly perturbed, versus when it would start evolving into a different shape. He showed, for example, that a certain critical ellipticity marked the transition. Beyond that, the Jacobi ellipsoid loses stability. In fact, Lyapunov found that as angular velocity increases, a Maclaurin spheroid would eventually bifurcate into a Jacobi ellipsoid, a known result, and that one of the Jacobi family eventually hits a bifurcation point, which we now understand as the onset of the pear-shaped sequence. Crucially, Lyapunov was able to rigorously confirm Poincaré's stability result for the Maclaurin ellipsoids. That is, they are stable up until the bifurcation of the Jacobi's sequence. He also closely scrutinized Poincaré's claim about the pear shape. Lyapunov's calculations later convinced him that the hypothetical pear-shaped figure, even if it exists, would be unstable. This was a bold stance that contradicted what some astronomers like George Darwin, Charles Darwin's son, were hypothesizing for the origin of the moon. But Lyapunov was right. Many years later, in 1917, physicist James Jeans confirmed that a pear-shaped mass would indeed be unstable, undermining Darwin's fission's theory for the moon formation. In other words, Lyapunov's master thesis had profound astronomical implications, and it helped settle whether a rapidly spinning planet could pinch off a moon by a stable pear-shaped intermediate. The answer? No, it can't, because the pear shape would fly apart before a satellite could form. For our story, the key takeaway is that Lyapunov's early research established him as a gifted problem solver who could apply deep mathematical tools, potential energy, variational principles, linear stability analysis, to a grand physical problem. He also set the stage for his life-defining work, the general theory of stability. As we'll see, The techniques and intuition he developed studying rotating fluids, especially the idea of using an energy-like function to judge stability, would directly inform his next, much broader breakthrough. With his master's degree attained in 1884 and his reputation growing, the 27-year-old Lyapunov embarked on a teaching career. In 1885, he was invited to Kharkov University, modern-day Ukraine, to become a private docent, the equivalent of what is today an associate professor in mechanics. He moved to Kharkov that autumn. It was a time of reaction and reform in Russian academia. The liberal university statutes of 1863 had just been rolled back in 1884, and students and faculty alike were wary of newcomers as potential government stooges. In fact, one of Lyapunov's first students, the future mathematician Vladimir Steklov, recalled that Kharkov student body initially assumed that the young Lyapunov must be some, and I quote, pitiful mediocrity sent by the reactionary education ministry, quoting from Smirnov's biography. However, this prejudgment evaporated literally within the first hour of Lyapunov's teaching. Steklov describes Lyapunov's inaugural lecture in 1885 in vivid detail. Let me quote again Smirnov. Into the auditorium, together with the elderly dean, there entered a handsome young man, almost the age of some of our colleagues, who, after the dean left, began to lecture in a voice quivering with agitation. But from the beginning of the lecture, I heard that something I had not encountered from any other instructor or textbook. All antipathy was immediately blown to dust. By the strength of his talent and the natural charm of youth, Alexander Mikhailovich, even without knowing, overcame in 1 hour the prejudiced attitude of the auditorium. From that day, Alexander Mikhailovich took a very special place in the eyes of the students, who came to regard him with exceptionally respectful esteem. The majority, who were not strangers to an interest in science, strained with all their strength to approach, however little, those heights to which Alexander Mikhailovich lifted his audience. This account by Steklov, who indeed became Lyapunov's first PhD student and a notable mathematician, testifies to Lyapunov's brilliance as a teacher and the impression he made in Kharkov. His lectures on mechanics introduced original insights that students hadn't heard before, and he delivered them with a mix of youthful fervor and deep understanding that won the students almost immediately. Lyapunov also threw himself into developing new courses and writing detailed lecture notes. He taught virtually the entire mechanics curriculum alone for several years, and the notes he produced were considered innovative and valuable enough to be discussed later by colleagues like academician Alexei Krylov. Despite heavy teaching duties, Lyapunov did not abandon research. In fact, after a few years in Kharkov, he returned to the problem that would secure his immortality in mathematics, the general stability of motion. By 1888, Lyapunov began publishing papers on the stability of mechanical systems with a finite number of degrees of freedom. These were essentially warm-ups to formulate a comprehensive theory. All this culminated in 1892 with Lyapunov's doctoral dissertation, the equivalent to a PhD, thesis or habilitation, entitled The General Problem of the Stability of Motion. Defended at Moscow University in September 1892 with none other than Nikolai Zhukovsky, the father of Russian aerodynamics, as an opponent, this thesis is often described as one of the most important in the history of mathematics. Few dissertations had such a sweeping impact. More than a century later, Lyapunov's work is still celebrated by the control community through dedicated conferences and commemorative articles. So what was the essence of Lyapunov's 1892 stability memoir? Well, in it, Lyapunov addressed a very general question. Given a dynamical system described by a differential equation, how does one determine whether a given solution, for example an equilibrium point, is stable or unstable against small perturbations? This might sound abstract, but it's fundamentally the question of whether a system will hold its state or veer off when slightly disturbed, be it a pendulum, a planet's orbit, or an electrical circuit's steady-state operation. Mathematicians before Lyapunov had some partial methods, for example linearization, or what Lyapunov called the first method, which had been used by Chebyshev's contemporary, the British engineer James Maxwell, as we have seen in one of the first episodes of this podcast, and also by Edward Routh, to analyze the stability of governors and other systems by looking at the eigenvalues of linear approximations. If you want to dive deeper into that story, we covered it back in, I believe, in our first episode. Worth a listen if you missed it. Lyapunov was aware of these developments. He cites Routh and was influenced by the work of Poincaré, who had applied series expansions to stability problems. In fact, Lyapunov's first method in his thesis corresponds to what we now call the linearization test. The idea is to approximate a nonlinear system near an equilibrium by expanding the vector field that defines the differential equation in a Taylor series expansion, and keeping only the first term. This produces a linear system whose stability can be read off from the eigenvalues of its matrix. Intuitively, if all those eigenvalues lie in the stable region, the higher order terms in the expansion count less, quote-unquote, and the nonlinear system will likewise remain stable under perturbations. Poincaré had independently developed this very same idea, so this was partly a case of Lyapunov refining existing knowledge. But what precisely do we mean by stability? Well, up to this point, mathematicians had spoken about systems being stable or unstable without a fully systematic definition. First, one must identify an equilibrium, a state where the system, if left alone, does not change over time. Think of a pendulum at rest or a ball sitting in a bowl. Once placed there, nothing happens unless it is disturbed. Stability then asks, what happens when we do disturb it? An equilibrium is stable if, when the system is nudged slightly, it does not wander off unpredictably, but instead remains close to where it started. If we put a pendulum hanging straight down, if we give it a kick and it swings, it will stay nearby. If we try to balance it upright and we give it the tiniest disturbance, that will send it toppling over. Stability, in essence, is about whether the small causes lead to small contained effects, or whether they grow and carry the system away. Going back to Lyapunov's dissertation, his innovation, what he called the second method, was what we now celebrate as Lyapunov's direct method. That was a completely new qualitative approach to stability that crucially did not require explicitly solving differential equations. Instead of analyzing trajectories over time, Lyapunov introduced an ingenious concept. Find a single scalar function of the system state, let's call it V, capital V, that behaves like an energy or quantifies the amount of disturbance, and watch how this V function changes as the system evolves. If you can show capital V always decreases, or at least never increases, then the system must be stable. Intuitively, it's like finding a virtual energy function that shows that the system only dissipates this virtual energy, ensuring that the system settles down rather than blowing up. In his thesis, Lyapunov formalized this idea. He required V to have certain properties. First, V has to be zero at the equilibrium of interest and positive away from it, so it truly measures departure from the equilibrium. And second, the time derivative of V along any trajectory of the system is negative, or at most zero. Again, the intuition is to think of V as an energy-like quantity that steadily dissipates along trajectories, pulling the system back towards equilibrium rather than letting it drift away. Under these conditions, Lyapunov proved the equilibrium is stable, and if the time derivative of V along any trajectory of the system is always negative except at the equilibrium, then the equilibrium is asymptotically stable. In other words, the state not only stays near, but actually converges to the equilibrium in the long run. In plainer words, if you can concoct a kind of generalized energy that always diminishes, the system will inexorably slide into its stable steady state, much like a marble finding the bottom of a bowl. This criterion was breathtakingly general. It did not assume linearity of the equations, small oscillations, or any specific form of the system. It applied to virtually any ordinary differential equation, no matter how nonlinear, provided you could guess or construct a suitable capital V function, which today bears the name of Lyapunov function. Lyapunov's direct method was groundbreaking because it shifted the perspective. Instead of necessarily solving differential equations, which is often difficult and at times impossible for nonlinear systems, one could judge stability by inspection of a function. It was essentially looking at an old problem from a new angle. This method elegantly generalized earlier insights. For example, in mechanical systems, a well-known criterion is the Lagrange-Dirichlet theorem. This theorem states that if the potential energy has a strict minimum at an equilibrium, then the equilibrium is stable. Lyapunov's function can be seen as a vast generalization of the idea of using energy as capital V. In fact, Lyapunov was undoubtedly inspired by his mechanics background. He knew that in conservative mechanical systems, energy is conserved. This is a well-known consequence of symmetry, which mathematician Emmy Noether would only formalize in 1915. If there's some damping, energy will decrease. So it was natural to guess that an energy-like function could serve to test stability beyond mechanics. He wrote in his thesis that one can often choose capital V to be something like the total energy, the kinetic energy plus the potential energy of a system. We see here the link to Noether's insight. Invariants and conserved quantities, like energy, momentum, etc., often underlie stability. And Lyapunov's genius was to harness that intuition in a general way. In many cases, finding a Lyapunov function is almost an art, guided by physical insight. Is energy conserved? Is there any quantity that always dissipates? As a matter of fact, as pointed out in a lecture by Stephen Boyd to celebrate the 120th anniversary of Lyapunov's thesis, this is also the Achilles heel of the method. Whenever we have a physical system, we typically reach for energy as a candidate Lyapunov function, which risks a kind of circular reasoning. The power of the method is undeniable though, but its limitation is that there is, in principle, no general constructive way to find a suitable Lyapunov function. Before we continue, let me try to illustrate Lyapunov's method in simple terms. Imagine a hill with a bowl-shaped valley at the bottom. You put a bowl somewhere on the hill, and the natural Lyapunov function is its potential energy, which directly depends on the bowl's height. The bowl's height is highest when far up the hill and lowest at the bottom of the bowl. As the bowl rolls with some friction, ideally, its potential energy decreases. If you can show that no matter where on the hill you place the bowl, it will always roll down and never up, you've proven stability of the equilibrium at the bottom, using energy as your Lyapunov function. And that bowl eventually settles at the bottom point in the bowl. Lyapunov extended this intuition to essentially any dynamical system by allowing capital V, the Lyapunov function, to be any well-behaved scalar function that captures the notion of distance or energy from equilibrium. The impact of Lyapunov's general stability criterion cannot be overstated. It armed scientists with a powerful tool to tackle nonlinear problems. However, Lyapunov himself, characteristically modest and focused, didn't spend much time in the dissertation elaborating corollaries or specific applications of the theory. As one commentator notes, beyond the intense 4-year burst that led to the 1892 thesis, Lyapunov, and I quote, devoted relatively little time to elaborating the consequences of his conclusion. In other words, he laid the foundations and then moved on to other mathematical pursuits, such as potential theory and probability. Lyapunov's stability theory might have languished in obscurity, gathering dust in the Mathematical Society of Kharkov's proceedings, where it was first published in Russian. Were it not for a French translation in 1907, a translation Lyapunov himself reviewed and corrected, adding some material. This French version, Problème général de la stabilité du mouvement, appeared in the Annales de Toulouse and helped Western European mathematicians become aware of this work. Still, for decades, the uptake of Lyapunov's methods was limited. By contrast, Lyapunov's shift into probability theory at the turn of the 20th century was as decisive as it was understated. Having established his reputation with the 1892 dissertation on stability, he now turned to the question about random phenomena and the foundations of statistics. His most celebrated achievement in this area was a general proof of the central limit theorem, completed around 1901. In simple terms, the central limit theorem explains why the familiar bell-shaped curve, the Gaussian or the normal distribution, however you want to call it, appears so often in nature and statistics. The theorem states that if you take a large number of independent random effects, even if one has different distributions, their properly scaled sum tends towards a normal distribution. Lyapunov's proof was among the first to formalize this idea with great generality, showing why noise or measurement errors and countless natural processes share the same underlying pattern. A key part of the argument was what we call today characteristic functions, essentially Fourier transforms of probability distributions. By studying these transforms, mathematicians can track how randomness behaves in the frequency domain and establish where sums of variables converge towards the normal distribution. Every version of the central limit theorem is, at its heart, a way of expressing a very simple fact. When you add together many small independent contributions, the result tends to form the familiar bell curve. Three ingredients are essential. There must be many contributions, none of them can be too large, and they cannot be too strongly dependent on one another. Lyapunov's condition gave one of the first precise ways of capturing the second requirement, the idea that no single increment could dominate the sum. This was more than a refinement. It gave the central limit theorem a rigor and generality that had allowed him to serve as a universal principle in probability theory. This line of work also connected him more closely with contemporaries. Chebyshev had paved the way, but it was Andrei Markov, Lyapunov's younger colleague and later close friend, who would carry the probabilistic program further. The two men met often at the St. Petersburg Academy of Science, where both were eventually elected as members. We'll talk about that later. Markov built on Lyapunov's foundations to develop what we now call Markov chains, models of random processes where the future depends only on the present, not on the past. While Lyapunov provided the first rigorous proof of the normal law for sums of independent variables, Markov extended the scope of probabilistic reasoning to dependent sequences. Their friendship left behind small but telling scenes. Markov, famously fiery and combative, was known to clash with almost everyone at the academy meetings, often interrupting, correcting, and sometimes even ridiculing his colleagues. But with Lyapunov, it was different. In the middle of any heated exchange, Markov might suddenly stop, turn toward him, and soften his tone, asking, "Sasha, perhaps you see it differently." For someone as blunt as Markov, this deference was remarkable. It showed that the quiet authority Lyapunov carried, not through the force of personality, but through the respect his intellect commanded. As Smirnov later commentators observed, the achievement of 1901 alone would have secured Lyapunov's name in the annals of mathematics, even without his contributions to stability. Some historians even argue that his probabilistic work foreshadowed entire fields of mathematics, statistics, statistical mechanics, and even information theory among them. It's worth pausing our narrative to humanize this brilliant mathematician with a few anecdotes. Lyapunov's personal life during the Kharkov period was content, even if somewhat introverted. In January 1886, during the winter break, he traveled back to St. Petersburg and finally married his cousin Natalia Sekhenova. Their marriage was by all accounts a happy union, though the two had no children. Natalia was intellectually close to him, and having been literally his study partner in youth, she took a warm interest in his scientific work. Lyapunov himself was known to be a reserved, deeply focused individual who often worked through the night. According to his brother Boris, in those Kharkov years, Alexander adopted a sort of owl-like schedule, thinking nothing of starting work at midnight and continuing for hours in the quiet darkness. Boris Mikhailovich Lyapunov left a charming reminiscence of their time living together as students in St. Petersburg. That was between 1881 and 1885, just before Alexander left for Kharkov. The two brothers shared a rented room in the apartment of a widow, Mrs. Mikhailovskaya, who happened to be the sister of Professor Ivan Sekhenov, the physiologist we mentioned before. the father of physiology in Russia. Every Sunday, their landlady hosted small gatherings of intellectuals and family. Boris recalls, and I quote, "Once a week at our landlady's apartment there gathered relatives, among them the physiologist Sekhenov, who loved to relax in the circle of studious youth coming together on Sundays at his sister's. I remember also that at that time my brother Alexander Mikhailovich gave lessons to Sekhenov in those parts of mathematics which he considered especially important for the physiologist Ivan Mikhailovich, who took the warmest pleasure in all scientific successes of Alexander Mikhailovich." This delightful snapshot shows Lyapunov's generous and unpretentious nature. Imagine the great Ivan Sekhenov, already famous in his phys as the founder of Russian physiology, relaxing on Sundays with students, and being tutored in mathematics by a bearded young Alexander Lyapunov. The image is almost poetic. The physiologist eager to learn some math relevant to experiments, and Lyapunov patiently teaching him calculus or differential equations to help his studies. It speaks to Lyapunov's helpfulness and engagement in broader science. Boris also mentions the, and I quote, pressure of work on his brother during the preparation for his master's defense, noting that Alexan often worked at night and was often absorbed in his research. Yet, even in those intense times, Alexan made time to share knowledge with others informally. He maintained close ties with Sekhenov until the latter's death, indicating a capacity for friendship across generations and disciplines. Lyapunov was not a flamboyant or widely social man. Quoting from another biography, like many mathematicians, he preferred to work alone and communicated mainly with a few colleagues and close relatives. He shunned frequently entertainment, visiting the theater or concerts only once or twice a year. His dedication to work was almost monastic, including regularly working 4 to 5 hours at night, sometimes till dawn. However, he did mentor many students and had a reputation for being a clear, inspiring teacher when he did interact. His students and colleagues respected him deeply. Steklov later remembered him as a, and I quote, personifying the best idealistic type of scholar, one who lived for pure pursuits of the mind and upheld high principles. In 1902, after 17 productive years in Kharkov, Alexander Lyapunov was elected a full member, an academician, if you like, of the Russian Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. Essentially, he was filling the seat of Chebyshev, his old mentor, who had passed away in 1894. This was a great honor and allowed Lyapunov to move back to the capital and devote himself entirely to research. The academy position relieved him from heavy teaching duties, and settling in St. Petersburg again in his mid-40s, Lyapunov turned his attention to some of the very problems Chebyshev at first challenged him with. In particular, he went back to the figures of equilibrium of rotating fluids, the problem of those pear-shaped forms and beyond, which he hadn't fully solved in the 1880s due to its difficulty. Over the next years, between 1903 and 1907, Lyapunov published a series of papers digging even deeper into celestial mechanics and fluid equilibrium. In 1903, he published Researches on the Figures of Celestial Bodies, and in 1904 another work on Clairaut's equation, planet figure theory. He critically examined Poincaré's claim of the pear-shaped figure and ultimately arrived at the conclusion we mentioned. The pear shape is not stable. Lyapunov wrote frankly to a colleague that Poincaré in his new book had apparently done, and I quote, what would have been the subject of my investigations, but stood at the same point as 17 years ago on the key question of the pear-shaped body. So Lyapunov felt his own work was not preempted. He then pressed on to fill the gaps. By showing that the pear-shaped figure would in fact not be a stable equilibrium, Lyapunov essentially closed the door on the path for cosmic fission theories. This was an important result in astronomy, as noted earlier. It corrected a significant hypothesis about the Earth's moon, ruling out the idea that a pear-shaped Earth could shed the moon, a hypothesis championed by George Darwin up to that point. It's important to note that Lyapunov, a pure mathematician at heart, was perfectly willing to engage with concrete physical theories and delivered verdicts that had real implications. In this sense, he was following the tradition of great applied mathematicians like Newton or Euler, using rigorous math to answer questions about the natural world. During this period, Lyapunov also took on editorial work. Notably, he helped publish Leonhard Euler's collected works, serving as an editor for 2 volumes, 18 and 19, of Euler's oeuvre. By the mid-1900s, Lyapunov's professional renown was international. In 1908, he traveled abroad to attend the 4th International Congress of Mathematicians in Rome, and here he was elected a corresponding member of the French Academy of Sciences and an honorary member of several other universities. Despite these accolades, Lyapunov remained the same quiet, industrious figure. Colleagues recall him often appearing shy or reserved at congresses, but always deeply insightful in conversations about science. Away from formal meetings, he also revealed another side of himself, of a very cute nature, a passion for the natural world. Friends remembered him carefully tending to plants, collecting specimens, and discussing botany with the same seriousness he brought to the mathematics. In Rome, he even visited the gardens and exhibitions of tropical flora, speaking with genuine enthusiasm about the delicate structures of leaves and flowers. Some of these specimens he carefully brought back home. As World War I and the Russian Revolution upheaved Lyapunov's world, the great mathematician's life took a tragic turn. By 1917, the political chaos and civil unrest in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, made daily life dangerous and difficult. That summer, Lyapunov decided to leave the capital and take his ailing wife Natalia to the south for her health. Unfortunately, Natalia had long suffered from tuberculosis, and her doctors advised her that the milder conditions of the Black Sea might alleviate her condition. The couple decided to relocate to the city of Odessa in 1917 in June. Initially, Odessa might have seemed like a safe haven, a quieter city away from the fighting. Lyapunov took up a post at Novorossiya University in Odessa, and for a short time in 1918 he continued some scientific work and teaching there. But as 1918 wore on, their personal circumstances worsened. Natalia's tuberculosis advanced rapidly, growing more and more frail and weak. At the same time, Lyapunov himself was experiencing health problems. His eyesight was deteriorating due to advancing cataracts, which threatened to rob the meticulous mathematician of his most important sense. Even more crushing, news came that the Lyapunov family estate on the Volga had been burned in the throes of the revolution. Along with that estate went a great library accumulated by his late father and grandfather, a library that Alexandra cherished deeply. All those books and memorabilia up in flames. It was an enormous emotional blow from which Lyapunov had a hard time recovering. By the autumn 1918, Alexandra Lyapunov was a man being tested on all fronts. First of all, physically. He was 61 years old, his eyesight failing, his strength worn down by years of restless nights and worry. Second, emotionally, by the impending loss of his long-life companion and cousin, and by the heartbreak of seeing his country and family heritage in ruins. And finally, mentally, by the despair that can afflict even the strongest spirits, while all around him the Russia he had known, along with its institutions, its traditions, its very sense of continuity seemed to crumble. Friends later recounted that Lyapunov appeared deeply depressed and anxious in those days. On October 31, 1918, Natalia Rafailovna Lyapunova succumbed to tuberculosis and passed away in Odessa. She and Alexandra had been married for 32 years. The very same day, upon witnessing his beloved wife's death, Alexander Lyapunov took a pistol and shot himself in the head. Gravely wounded, he did not die immediately, but he fell into a coma and lingered for 3 more days. Alexander Mikhailovich Lyapunov died on November 3, 1918, just as Natalia was being laid to rest. In a final note, he requested that he be buried together with her. It was a heart-rending end. One of the world's greatest mathematical minds, unable to find stability in his own life amid such turmoil. choosing to depart the same world that had given him so much joy in abstract pursuits. Alexander Lyapunov's influence on science and engineering has only grown with time. In the aftermath of his death, colleagues in Russia eulogized him in academy meetings, and his collected works were published, ensuring that the future generations could study his findings. But the real legacy of Lyapunov lives in the myriad theorems, methods, and applications that sprouted from these seeds he planted. In an attempt to do justice to this legacy, we're going to explore how Lyapunov's ideas propagated through the 20th century and into the 21st, a journey of concepts from stability theory to modern control engineering, dynamical systems, and even cybernetics. It is in Russia and the broader Soviet scientific sphere that Lyapunov's work initially took the deepest root. Perhaps unsurprisingly, even before his passing, a number of talented Russian mathematicians had taken up the study of nonlinear dynamics and oscillations, clearly drawing on Lyapunov's approaches. In the 1920s and 30s, two major research centers emerged. One led by physicist Leonid Mandelstam in Moscow, where a young Alexander Andronov was a key figure, and another around Nikolai Krylov and Nikolai Bogulyobov in Kiev. These groups were studying problems like self-sustained oscillators, synchronization, and the so-called mitname, or entrainment phenomenon, of coupled oscillators and other nonlinear phenomena. Andronov in particular demonstrated how Poincaré and Lyapunov's method could explain the existence of stable limit cycles in radio oscillator circuits, for example, in the van der Pol oscillator. He essentially linked the abstract notion of a limit cycle, think of a periodic or almost periodic trajectory in the phase space, to real-world self-oscillations in engineering. The terminology and techniques we use today in nonlinear dynamics, phase portraits, equilibria, limit cycles, were disseminated widely thanks to Andronov and collaborators like Igor Kaikin, and initially also Witt, who published the influential book Theory of Oscillations in 1937. That text brought Lyapunov's qualitative methods to a broad audience of scientists and engineers in the Soviet Union. Simultaneously, Krylov and Bogulyobov in Kiev were developing an asymptotic approach to nonlinear mechanics, so-called averaging methods, again rooted in Poincaré-Lyapunov's tradition. They published Introduction to Nonlinear Mechanics in 1937, focusing on nonlinear oscillation problems and using Lyapunov's first method as a basis using series expansions. During this pre-war era, other Soviet mathematicians like Chetayev and Eiserman extended Lyapunov's stability theory in various ways. Chetayev found refinements for cases where Lyapunov's functions, derivatives, are not necessarily negative. Today, this result is known as Chetayev's theorem of instability. Lyapunov's name became enshrined in the Soviet education. He was portrayed as a national scientific hero, part of a lineage from Euler and Chebyshev. His methods were taught to engineers, especially in the burgeoning field of automatic control. In fact, historian Bissell notes that by the mid-20th century, the Soviet Union had two key strands in control engineering. One tracing back to the classical control of mechanical governors via Vishnegradsky and Zhukovsky, and the other rooted firmly in Lyapunov's stability theory. Both strands fed the explosive growth and control technology in the USSR, from stability of power grids to guided systems. One telling anecdote of Lyapunov's Soviet legacy comes from 1953. The Soviet Academy of Sciences finally identified Lyapunov's overgrown grave in Odessa and had it restored with the commemorative inscription mentioned above. It was a significant and symbolic reclaiming of pride at the dawn of the space age. The USSR wanted to honor the man whose work on stability was vital for everything from rockets to reactors. Perhaps more interestingly, Lyapunov's influence extended to the nascent field of cybernetics and computer science in the Soviet Union in the late 40s and early 50s. While Norbert Wiener's cybernetics was initially viewed with suspicion in Stalin's USSR, a group of Soviet scientists embraced it once the ideological barriers fell. One of the founders of Soviet cybernetics was, by a twist of fate, Alexei Andreevich Lyapunov, notably sharing the last name. Alexei was indeed from the extended Lyapunov family and a brilliant mathematician in his own right. He became a pioneer in computing, programming theory, and artificial intelligence in the USSR and was a driving force behind recognizing cybernetics as a legitimate science in the Soviet Union. While Alexei's work was quite separate from that of Alexander Lyapunov, classical stability theory, the coincidence of their names and kinship is often noted. As mentioned earlier, for a surprising long time, Lyapunov's work remained little known in the Western Europe and the United States. This was partly a language issue, because few Western engineers read Russian or French fluently. In part, it was also a matter of discipline. Pure mathematicians knew of Lyapunov's work, but engineers tackling practical control problems between the 20s and the 40s were often unaware of it. Historian Bissell describes this as, and I quote, a classic tale of lack of communication within the world of technology. The West and the Soviet Union were developing control theory on parallel tracks, not interacting much. In the West, classical frequency domain methods such as Nyquist plots, body diagrams, etc. dominated mid-century control engineering, and nonlinear stability analysis was less mainstream. It took the pressures of the Cold War and the space race to change that. In the 1950s, high-performance aircraft, guided missiles, and space vehicles forced Western engineers to grapple with complex nonlinear dynamics and stringent stability requirements. Suddenly, the elegant stability techniques from the Soviet literature became of great interest. Starting in the mid-50s, there was a surge of translations and scholarly exchange. Russian works on stability were translated into English. For example, Solomon Lefschetz, a leading American mathematician that we discussed in the episode dedicated to Richard Bellman, became an evangelist for Lyapunov's theory after World War II. In a 1957 United States Air Force technical report on nonlinear mechanics, Lefschetz pointed out pointedly that it was, and I quote, a particular point of concern that Lyapunov's theory of stability and the use of methods that have been almost completely ignored outside the USSR needed urgent attention in the West. By 1960, the tide had fully turned. Lyapunov's name became commonplace in international journals, and in 1962 the International Federation of Automatic Control, also known as IFAC, held a major symposium on the centenary of Lyapunov's doctoral thesis. And Western participants marveled at the depth of work coming from the USSR. To give a concrete milestone, Lyapunov's 1892 dissertation was finally translated into English in 1992 by Fuller, a full 100 years after its original publication. This delay is astonishing, but by the time the translation appeared, Lyapunov's methods had already been fully assimilated worldwide through other channels. Once Lyapunov's stability theory became part of a global scientific conversation, it proved incredibly fertile. Over the course of the 20th century, it inspired a wide range of theoretical breakthroughs. And now, as promised at the beginning, it's time to geek out a bit. I'll highlight some of the key outgrowths, roughly in chronological order, of Lyapunov's theory. Of course, I can't cover everything, so apologies in advance to those I leave out. If you think something important is missing, please reach out. It could be a great pointer for a future episode. The first result I'm going to highlight is Macera's theorem, dating back to the 1950s. José Luis Macera was a Uruguayan mathematician of Italian origin who, around 1956, proved an important converse-type theorem. For certain classes of systems, notably autonomous systems on the real line of periodic systems, if an equilibrium is globally asymptotically stable, there must exist a Lyapunov function certifying that stability. The question here is what we mean by converse. Lyapunov had shown that if you can find a suitable Lyapunov function, then you can conclude the system is stable. Macera's result turns this around and seeks to address under what conditions does the stability of a system imply the existence of a Lyapunov function. Of course, the catch is that Macera's proof is not constructive. It tells us that a Lyapunov function exists, but not how to find it. In practice, that still remains the hard part. But still, Macera's theorem was one of the first of many and later extensions by An, Zubov, and others that formed the backbone of a series of works that go today under the name of converse Lyapunov theorems, which essentially establish Lyapunov's method is, at least in principle, a complete characterization of stability. Another major milestone came in 1960 with Joe LaSalle and his invariance principle. This is perhaps the most famous extension of Lyapunov's method, And if you remember, we already covered Joe LaSalle in Richard Bellman's episode, where the two interacted during their time at Princeton. Building on Lyapunov's original framework, LaSalle observed that the requirement for a Lyapunov function to always decrease, like an energy that continually drains away, was stronger than necessary. His principle showed that it was enough for the function to never increase. Even if energy sometimes plateaus, the system can be still shown to converge by asking what happens on that plateau. LaSalle's key insight was that trajectories must eventually settle into the part of the system where nothing changes any further, which is what we call an invariant set. And if the only such set is an equilibrium itself, then every trajectory will end up there. Intuitively, it's like watching a ball roll into a ball with a very flat bottom. Even if the ball slows down and seems to pause, it cannot escape and will eventually settle at rest. If the flat region exists only at the very bottom, then that point is the equilibrium. This principle greatly expands the reach of Lyapunov's method, especially for systems where the energy does not strictly decrease at every instant, and in fact it's used still very widely in system analysis. Around the same period, the Soviet mathematician Nikolai Krasovsky offered a more constructive approach. His idea was that instead of searching for a Lyapunov function through intuition alone, one could sometimes build one directly from the equations of motion. Instead of relying on intuition or physical insight, Krasovsky suggested looking at the vector field that defines the dynamics. Think of the arrows associated with each point in space, telling the system how to move, and taking their square length as a candidate Lyapunov function. In other words, measure how strong the push of the dynamics is at each point and use that as your gauge. If this quantity consistently shrinks as the system evolves, then you have a valid Lyapunov function, and thus a proof of stability. The method doesn't work in all cases, but when it does, it offers a straightforward way to bypass the guesswork usually required in building a Lyapunov function. Beyond this trick, Krasovsky's broader work on stability of time-varying systems and on differential games was very influential, and his textbooks helped spread Lyapunov theory widely during the 60s. In the 60s, Valery Matrosov pushed the framework even further. He realized that some systems simply refuse to be captured by a single Lyapunov function. Instead, one may need to look at several Lyapunov functions together, each illuminating a different aspect of the system's behavior. No one of them tells the whole story, but taken together, they guarantee stability. This turned out to be especially useful for systems that change over time and for those that switch between different modes of operation. In such cases, one function might decrease in one mode and another one in a different mode. Yet combined, they prevent instability. So this theorem turns out to be particularly valuable in adaptive control and in systems that change structure over time, where flexibility is key and no single yardstick suffices. While Macera's, LaSalle's, and Krasovsky and Matrosov's methods were deepening the theoretical underpinnings of Lyapunov's method, control engineers faced very practical questions though. When you connect a linear system with a nonlinear element in feedback, how do you know that the control loop won't oscillate wildly or run away? This challenge gave rise to what became known as absolute stability theory, the study of stability in interconnected feedback systems with both linear and nonlinear plans. Two landmark results from 1960s stand out here, the Popov criterion and the circle criterion. Vladimir Popov, a Soviet engineer, introduced a graphical test in 1962, the so-called Popov line, that allowed engineers to check stability directly from the frequency response of the linear part. Around the same time, researchers in both the United States and the Soviet Union, including Jury and Yakubovich, developed the circle criterion, which gave a geometric test based on Nyquist plots. Both results had a similar spirit. They translated some of Lyapunov's abstract ideas into the familiar language of frequency domain analysis, Bode plots, and Nyquist diagrams that engineers already used to design amplifiers and controllers. At this stage in history, though, and it's important to underscore this, Lyapunov stability and absolute stability were seen as different concepts. One belonged to the mathematical theory of dynamical systems, and the other to engineering practice of feedback design. It was only later in 1972 that Jan Willems unified these perspectives through his theory of dissipative systems, showing that both Lyapunov's methods and absolute stability criteria could be understood within a single elegant framework. The deeper connection already implicit in the Popov and Circle criteria was that satisfying these tests is equivalent to the existence of a special kind of Lyapunov function, a quadratic form but adapted to capture the interaction between linear dynamics and bounded nonlinearities. This link showed that Lyapunov's method and frequency domain reasoning were really two sides of the same coin. These criteria became cornerstones of absolute stability theory and profoundly shaped how engineers approached the design of feedback systems with nonlinearities such as saturation, dead zones, and relays. In modern terms, these results can be seen as early milestones of absolute stability theory, and today we recognize them in special cases that can be derived through the so-called S procedure, using linear matrix inequalities, a topic we'll return to shortly. As the field of nonlinear control matured, the concept of control Lyapunov function came to the forefront. The idea is powerful. Such a function not only certifies stability under some feedback law, but also provides a way to actually construct that stabilizing feedback. Zvi Yarstein had shown that the existence of a differentiable control Lyapunov function is equivalent to the existence of a regular stabilizing feedback. Building on this, Eduardo Sontag gave the concept its modern, definitive form. He proved that if a nonlinear system can be globally asymptotically stabilized by some feedback, then it admits a smooth control Lyapunov function. Even more, he provided a universal recipe, the celebrated Yarstein-Sontag universal formula, making effectively solving the problem of converting Lyapunov functions into actual controllers. This marked a shift in perspective. Lyapunov's method was no longer just an analysis tool where one guessed a function to check stability, but a synthesis tool, where one could design the function first and then derive the controller from it. Since then, much of nonlinear control design, from backstepping to modern optimization-based approaches, has revolved around finding a control Lyapunov function. Up to the 90s, stability theory has largely focused on equilibria, usually under the simplifying assumption that no external disturbances were present. In 1989, Eduardo Sontag again pushed the field forward by introducing the notion of input-to-state stability, which broadened the picture dramatically. The idea was to capture robustness, both quantitatively and qualitatively. Small disturbances should only produce small deviation, and if disturbances vanish, the system should return to equilibrium. In essence, it blended the concepts of stability and disturbance rejection into a single elegant framework. Just as with control Lyapunov functions, the notion came with its own Lyapunov characterization. One could certify input-to-state stability by constructing a function that decreases along trajectories except for terms that explicitly account for the input. This made it possible to reason rigorously about robustness in nonlinear systems, and crucially about networks of interconnected subsystems. If each piece of the network has the input-to-state property, the whole system remains stable under interconnection. ISS thus became fundamental in robust control and cascaded systems analysis. It's particularly useful in analyzing interconnected systems where each subsystem has the ISS property, because it ensures that the network remains stable under interconnections, of course under some assumptions. In the 90s, with the rise of powerful interior point algorithms for convex optimization, the search for Lyapunov functions also became something you could hand over to a computer. For linear systems, stability boils down to a simple condition: find a symmetric, positive definite matrix such that a certain inequality holds. This is the celebrated Lyapunov equation, and in continuous time it takes the form that engineers now routinely check with linear matrix inequality. Thanks to LMIs, linear matrix inequalities, one could not only certify stability, but also optimize over the Lyapunov matrix for certain purposes, for example, maximizing robustness margins. The impact was profound. MATLAB's LMI toolbox and similar software made it routine to solve large-scale Lyapunov inequalities, bringing computational power directly into controller design. Classical tools like the linear quadratic regulator or the Kalman filter, long known to rely on Riccati equations, could be now seen as special cases of this general LMI framework. Meanwhile, numerical linear algebra devoted entire algorithms, such as the Balters, Stewart, and Hammerling methods, to solving Lyapunov equations efficiently, making it possible to handle models with millions of states in areas like finite element analysis and model reduction. Looking back, it is remarkable how present Jan Willems had been. In his 1971 paper titled Least Squares, Stationary Optimal Control and the Algebraic Riccati Equation, he writes, and I quote, "The basic importance of the LMI seems to be largely underappreciated. It would be interesting to see whether or not it can be exploited in computational algorithms, for example." By the 1990s, that vision had come true. LMIs were not only appreciated, but they had become the backbone of computational control theory. The ubiquity of the Lyapunov equation is striking. Every time an aerospace engineer designs an autopilot using LQR, they are implicitly solving one. Every time a Kalman filter is tuned, a Lyapunov equation ensures the covariance remains well-behaved. And in robust control, variance of the inequality provides certificates of exponential stability. It is no surprise then that the Lyapunov equation has become one of the most widely recognized concepts carrying his name, so fundamental that entire software libraries are devoted to it. Another line of thought that emerged in the 90s has remained very active to this day, and this is contraction analysis. Unlike Lyapunov's approach, which certifies the stability of a single equilibrium, contraction looks at the distance between any two trajectories. If all trajectories converge exponentially towards each other, the system essentially forgets its initial conditions and is said to be contractive. This can be checked by finding a metric, a smoothly varying matrix that defines an infinitesimal distance, if you like, that shrinks along the flow being the map that associates an initial condition to a trajectory in state space. In spirit, it is similar to a Lyapunov function, but instead of a scalar energy-like quantity, one works with a quadratic form on perturbations that decrease everywhere. Contraction theory was popularized by Jean-Jacques Slotin. We have a whole dedicated episode also back in the days, and others in the 1990s. And we discussed it at length also in our episode with not only Jean-Jacques, but also Francesco Bullo, who is currently championing some of the latest developments. It has proven powerful for analyzing synchronization in networks, designing observers, and understanding robustness in nonlinear systems. More recently, this perspective was extended by Ian Manchester and collaborators to what are now called control contraction metrics, which play the same role for control design as control Lyapunov functions do for classical stability. A control contraction metric provides a certificate that the closed-loop system is contracting under some feedback law, and much like Lyapunov inequalities, it can be often found through convex optimization. This has enabled new synthesis methods for nonlinear control with applications ranging from robotics to motion planning for drones, where exponential stabilizability of trajectories can be guaranteed. Further pioneering contributions came in the late 90s and early 2000s, where a number of researchers laid much of the groundwork for switched and hybrid systems. I can quote many, from Michael Branicki to Daniel Lieberzohn to John Ligeros and George Pappas to Panos Antsaklis and many more. As control applications grew more complex, systems appeared that mixed continuous dynamics with discrete logic. Think of an autonomous vehicle switching between modes or a software-controlled system toggling between different controllers. Stability theory had to adapt. One approach was the idea of multiple Lyapunov functions rather than a single global function. You might assign, as we mentioned earlier, different ones to different modes, with conditions that govern how they behave during mode transitions. Researchers also pursued the notion of a common Lyapunov function, a single measure of energy that works for all modes and proves stability regardless of the system switches. Both perspectives were natural extensions of Lyapunov's method, ensuring that even when the equations change abruptly, some form of energy still decreases overall. These ideas prove crucial in establishing stability of hybrid control systems, power electronics that switch on and off, and many related applications. Later, people like Andy Thiel, Rafael Goebel, and Riccardo Sanfelice developed a unifying framework for hybrid inclusions, providing general Lyapunov functions for analyzing stability, while Raphael Jungers advanced the mathematical side of switch systems through Lyapunov methods again. By the 2000s, model predictive control had become a mainstream tool in engineering. We have already talked at length about it in the episode with Manfred Varari, one of its pioneers. Although the method was born decades earlier, in the late 70s and 80s, it only reached wide adoption once computing power made real-time optimization really feasible. The central idea is to handle constraints explicitly by solving an optimization problem at each sampling instant. The risk, of course, is that of chasing performance alone, and that this can drive the system unstable if the optimizer makes the wrong trade-offs. To prevent this, predictive controllers often embed Lyapunov's theory in the formulation, typically through a terminal cost or terminal constraint that ensures the existence of a Lyapunov function beyond the prediction horizon. In other words, the optimizer is given a safety net. No matter what it chooses in the short term, stability is guaranteed in the long run. In practice, this often takes the form of a quadratic terminal cost and a stabilizing linear feedback with a known Lyapunov certificate. The result is that even these cutting-edge numerical techniques carry Lyapunov's fingerprint at their core. And as the popular meme goes in the control theory community, model predictive control can be seen as a sort of brute force way of building Lyapunov functions. Google that meme, it's super fun. Moving on to the late 2000s was the application of sum of squares optimization to the search of Lyapunov functions. As we mentioned, constructing a Lyapunov function from given dynamics is hard in principle. So researchers such as Pablo Parrillo, Steven Prajna, and Antonis Papatristodoulou showed how semi-definite programming could be used to automatically construct polynomial Lyapunov functions for polynomial systems. The idea is to parameterize a polynomial candidate and then require that both the function itself and its derivative belong to the class of sum of squares, which guarantees that they are globally non-negative or non-positive. By letting a solver determine the coefficients, the hunt for a Lyapunov function could be turned into a computational procedure. What had once been an art of educated guessing could now, at least in some cases, be automated. Beyond stability, the same machinery has been used now for reachability, safety verification, and even controller synthesis, areas where having a reliable certificate is critical. And this line of work is still very much alive today, driving progress at the intersection of optimization, control, verification, and robotics. In 2010s, Lyapunov-inspired methods began to address not only stability but also safety. We talked about this issue also in a previous podcast with Miroslav Krstic. We know now that modern autonomous systems must stay within safe sets. Think of a drone avoiding obstacles and a car staying in its lane. This led to the idea of control barrier function, introduced in 2014 by a paper by Aaron Ames, Jesse Grizzle, and Paolo Tabuada on adaptive cruise control, and later expanded in a general methodology that leverages quadratic programs to solve tractable optimization problems in real time. The key idea of control barrier functions is really elegant. A barrier function is like a sort of dual of a Lyapunov function. Instead of certifying convergence, it ensures trajectories never leave a safe set. When combined with a Lyapunov function, one can set up a small quadratic optimization problem at each control step that balances the two requirements, driving the system towards stability while guaranteeing safety constraints are never violated. This approach has become since extremely popular in robotics and autonomous systems, and what makes the method powerful is its practicality. The condition reduces to convex programs that can be solved in real time, and it remains a very active area of research today, uniting Lyapunov's 19th century wisdom with that of modern demands of autonomy, where stability and safety must go hand in hand. Finally, a new frontier has recently opened with the rise of neural Lyapunov functions. Researchers are now combining machine learning with Lyapunov theory, training neural networks to act as Lyapunov functions, approximators for complex systems. Given simulation data of a nonlinear system, a network can be trained to output a scalar candidate that decreases along trajectories with suitable constraints, such as enforcing positivity and monotonic decrease via optimization or formal verification. These neural Lyapunov functions provide a flexible and expressive way to discover certificates for systems so complex that human intuition alone may not suffice. This is still an emerging area, but it highlights how Lyapunov's core idea continues to inspire innovation at the interface of artificial intelligence and control. Of course, as mentioned, I couldn't cover everything in this overview of the legacy of Lyapunov. I didn't cover, for example, its connection to physical system, Lagrangian systems, Porto-Hamiltonian system, championed by Arjan van der Skaft. I didn't cover its extensions also to density-like concepts by Anders Ranzer. I refer you to that episode if you are curious. And I didn't cover also its extensions to behaviors that are, in a sense, more nonlinear than equilibria. Thinking of multi-stable systems and oscillatory systems with the works on, say, dominance and monotone systems. You can actually find some excerpts in that direction with the episode that I recorded a long time ago with Rodolphe Sepulcre. As we come to the end of this episode, it is worth remembering that beyond the direct scientific lineage, Lyapunov's legacy also lives on in our culture and through the broader achievements of his family. In memorials and honors, Alexander Lyapunov has not been forgotten today. He has a crater on the moon named after him, fittingly, given his work on celestial figures. Streets in a few Russian cities still bear his name. In 1957, the USSR, as I mentioned, issued a postage stamp on the centenary of his birth, calling him a great Russian mathematician. More recently, the international control community has held a number of events in his honor. In June 2012, an IFAC symposium on the control education in Nizhny Novgorod, the city of his youth, was dedicated to a 120-year anniversary of Lyapunov's stability theory. And in 2017, at the IFAC World Congress in Toulouse, home to that 1907 French translations of his thesis, a special tribute session marked Lyapunov's 160th birthday and the 125th anniversary of his landmark memoir. It's why moving to consider that in 1892, a young man in Kharkov writes down a theory in Russian, hoping a few mathematicians might take note, and in 2017, researchers from all over the world gather in France, specifically to honor that work's longevity. As we conclude this journey through Lyapunov's life and legacy, it's clear that its influence is truly everywhere. Each time an engineer designs a controller that guarantees your airplane will fly steady, each time a mathematician proves a new system will converge, and each time a complex network's robustness is quantified, Lyapunov's spirit is there, in the principle that a single scalar function can illuminate the fate of an infinite continuum of trajectories. The man who sought the stability of rotating ellipsoids ended up gifting the world a universal method to find equilibrium amid complexity. In a deeper sense, Lyapunov's work embodies a hopeful message. Even in systems that appear wildly complicated, there may exist a simple function that reveals order and predictability. It's almost poetic that Lyapunov's life, which ended amid personal chaos, gave birth to a tool that helps ensure stability and order in our technological world. In the memory of Alexander Lyapunov, we see the convergence of a brilliant mind and a fundamental idea. His legacy lives on not just in equations and theorems, but in every stable orbit, every balanced bridge, every controlled heartbeat pacemaker, and every reliable circuit, thanks to a Lyapunov function that does not spiral out of control. Thank you for listening to this exploration of Alexander Lyapunov's life and impact. Through triumphs and tragedies, through 19th century lectures and 21st century algorithms, Lyapunov's quest for stability continues to resonate. A lasting reminder that clarity and insight can prevail even when the world is wobbling. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.
Thank you for listening. I hope you liked the show today. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider giving us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, follow us on Spotify, support on Patreon or PayPal, and connect with us on social media platforms. See you next time.